Good afternoon, really good evening now, ladies and gentlemen. I want to thank you again for taking the time to listen to what I have to say. So this is part two of a commentary, a statement that I have felt that I trying to take feeling out of it and present myself as objectively as possible. This is part two of a statement that I have decided to make in response to criticisms that I received quite recently by a student of philosophy and bassist of a libertarian persuasion named Duke Manning. Mr. Manning made some interesting comments. I would just I'll review the items that I underlined in particular. Mr. Manning says that he believes that I need to step back and consider my ideological commitments, the underlying basis for my ideological commitments, and square away my understanding of these things as he says I seem to jump in head first with a thought I have without really doing enough research and considering how certain I am. So I wanted to address that. I wanted to indeed make it clear that I do have very particular thoughts regarding my ideological commitments. I wanted to make it clear that I have quite a basis for it, rooting all the way back in my epistemological beliefs and principles. And the claim is there that I have, I dive into a thought without really doing enough research and considering how certain I am. To be clear, I think virtually every commentary that I've been providing, at least within the last year or two, has been sourced. That is, I base my deductions based on literature out there and the evidence before us. So I viewed the tone of Mr. Manning's diatribe against me, or his criticism against me. The tone in my interpretation was actually condescending. And secondly, his claims, I did not notice any basis for them. He claims he has at least one basis for he alleges that I do not deeply investigate my thoughts. And he cites the example of half a decade ago when I was a believer of libertarian ideology that I now disavow utterly, that I had argued at one point in favor of establishing a poll tax. And he had vehemently argued with me that that was a very bad idea. He says I was reluctant to accept his point of view on that. I guess I was at first. It was so long ago, I don't remember all the nuances of my thinking at the time. However, I can tell you that my mind was changed anyway on that policy issue. That's the only thing he's managed to cite as an example of my, he refers to my views as unrefined. That was the only explicit empirical example he gave about me of unrefined thinking. Was a silly idea I had 5 years ago that within months I did away with. Has nothing to do with who I am now, does not reflect who I am now and what I believe in any way. And so the reason that I am making this video is because I want to be on the record exactly what I do believe and why I believe it. So anytime someone wants to characterize my thinking, or anytime someone wants to attack the foundations of my views and what my views actually are, or take something I said at one point and suggest that's what I think now, I want it clear that the things I am saying in this video, this second part of the series, and what I said in the first one, these things that I'm saying now on the record are the things that I believe. And I believe them with pretty firm conviction. I believe they are based on laws of logic and on empirical evidence. So I had given you in the first video, just to sum for those of you who are watching this new video, I want to say hello to those viewers that I have who have said hello, Mr. Kevin Caruso, Mr. Gracia Henriquez. Thank you, gentlemen, so much for taking the time to listen to what I have to say. It's such a privilege that you would be willing to hear out what I have to say. So I began the first video in outlining a sort of biography of policy positions that I took as priority and why I did. And that was that. And then I discussed my view on democracy as the best political system for us. It should go without saying, I think, but I wanted to make it clear why I believe that a democracy, that believing in having a democracy is so important, and having a discussion about that. And so I explained essentially that there's nothing on earth or in the universe that suggests that one person ought to have political power of more weight than another person in terms of decision making and authority. And I said that to equalize this and to be fair, a democracy makes sense. And then I talked about how there's a question then of, once we determine essentially how authority should be established, the next question is, what should the authority have the power to do? That is to say, to what degree can they prevent us from doing the things in this life that we want to do? And I was talking about how this, therefore, enables a discussion on freedom and the role freedom should play in our political lives. And I more or less left off essentially with that. So I want to talk about freedom and the idea of freedom and the idea of degrees of freedom and why we want to think about those two concepts. So as I mentioned in the prior video, but I'll restate again, as I understand, excuse me, my throat's a little dry. As I understand the importance of freedom, as I understand it, you cannot thrive if you are not basically free. You cannot thrive if you are not basically free, because you are therefore either being controlled and therefore lacking the ability to cultivate your own intelligence and your own skill set, and you're therefore either at the whims of, you're either at the mercy of someone else, and you are given provisions exclusively by some other person or persons, and therefore you're rendered dependent person, or you're just not free to do the basic things to take care of yourself, and therefore, I mean, you starve. So very logical, easy deductions, in my opinion, as I understand it. Moving on then, what happens if we have pure, unfettered freedom? What does that look like? Well, I think it's problematic if we have complete freedom and no checks on our freedom. I'm not saying that we should be controlled, but I'm saying there's a difference between controlling someone and addressing problems that ensue as a result of unfettered freedom. So let's talk about a few examples. Let's use a really visceral example and one that's just so relevant to our society today. let's talk about guns. Let's suppose that there was no law whatsoever regulating the purchase, the sale and purchase and production of firearms. That would mean any insane person would have immediate access to guns, or very easy access to guns, and then could participate in a mass shooting. Not a good idea, because that's a threat to our lives. One could argue, well, if everyone has a gun, then the other person with the gun can stop the bad person with the gun, but that just doesn't always happen. And again, I'm talking more here just examining consequences of pure freedom. I'm not here to have a long, in-depth policy analysis of different approaches to guns. I'm here to say that the basic consequence of giving people unfettered access to guns, i.e. pure freedom, the consequence of that will be we're going to be in a situation where we may not always be able to defend ourselves against insane people who are psychopathic and want to shoot up some area. We have a right to defend ourselves against violence. That's a very basic thing that we should be allowed to do, is to protect ourselves against something like that. So this suggests that, and by the way, why? Why do we have that right? We have that right because it begins on the more fundamental notion of no one can have authority over anyone else, except in a really carefully regulated democratic process. So some insane person has no authority on my life. Therefore, the notion that they can go get a gun if they're insane and shoot me, they just don't have that right in a logical sense. If the preservation of one's right to thrive is our fundamental ethical value. So let's talk about another example. Let's talk about the example of, let's delve into economics and talk about, let's say, the wages that employers pay their employees, or talk about the issues of exploitation, okay? So one thing that history has taught us time and time again is that in a lot of instances, if you give someone the freedom to exploit others, in many instances, that opportunity to exploit will be taken advantage of, will occur. That's history has proven that time and time again. I mean, look at the foundations of slavery. Yes, there was obviously racist elements, of course, to the motivations of slavery and the institution of slavery, but there was also the fact that nobody was going to stop plantation owners from doing it, so they were going to do it. We saw that without a law to have the force and without the law to prevent that, it wasn't going to stop. In fact, tragically, we had to fight a civil war over it and pass the Emancipation Proclamation. And then the 14th Amendment had to be passed so that things like slavery would be prevented by the government. And by the way, even after the Civil War, when slavery was prohibited, even after that happened, if you know your history, what happened during the so-called, what happened afterwards, right? You had a lot of terrorism and, again, perpetrated against blacks and whites who were protective of the rights of blacks, right? This was during the era of Reconstruction. So the government did its best to enforce anti-black, the government did the best it could to counter violence and thereby enforce the rights of blacks. However, the violence of the racist South was so vehement that it exhausted the federal government. And in the election of 1876, Rutherford B. Hayes made an agreement with the gentleman, I don't know if it was a gentleman, the fellow that he ran against, I believe it was Samuel Tilden, because their election was too close to call, and he said, I'll tell you what, I will put an end to this Reconstruction stuff if you'll give me the election. So throughout so much of our history, we had people who were given the freedom, essentially, to harm others by way, in this case, through racism and violent acts motivated by racism, because they were essentially free to do it. They did it. So you just can't have unfettered freedom, because too many people will take advantage of that. Now, let's talk about the union movement. That's another example. We've had to have political leaders really act quite forcefully and intensely to stand up for the rights of employees to unionize. And the fact is that if you give employers the freedom to prevent workers from unionizing, prevent their freedom, then they will exploit that freedom. It's a fact. That's what history has proven. So, the accusation someone might make that, I don't know, well, you haven't cited 17 philosophers on the topic, so you're not a strong thinker or what have you. I mean, I'm just citing the story of the development of politics and political behavior in the United States. So you can talk about the history. It's fact, right? So these things have really moved me to be very passionate in being mindful of situations where unfettered freedom enables people who are exploitive to, in whatever fashion, partake in exploitation. And we can take a look also, let's say, at the fight over environmental protections. The fact is, you'll have people who will pollute as much as they want to, unless you use the force of law to stop them from doing it, because they're greedy and they are motivated by greed and will exploit. Now, you could argue at some point the culture could evolve and we could become, as a people, so inherently not greedy that maybe regulations and certain moves to curb certain freedoms will become unnecessary, but that just isn't the case today. In fact, if we look at the things that are happening today, it would seem we're experiencing a period of exceptional greed. And if people are given the freedom to do wrong and not be held accountable for the harmful activities they undertaken to indulge in this greed, then we're going to have a problem. One only need to look at, for example, the Paul Manafort case. We've seen before our very eyes people testify to the fact that Paul Manafort lied on his tax returns and lied to banks in an attempt to get loans. He saw a way to get money, one which clearly no one was watching, so he did it. That's just what too many people do, is they exploit and take advantage where they think they can. So when we see that a lot of that is happening, we have to make a policy to counter that. So that's my view on that. Let's talk about taxation. There's the libertarian argument of, it's my money, I have the right to keep all of it. You have no right to take it from me. Well, let's evaluate the income disparity and what the effects of that has been. And that will show why that there is indeed a compelling reason why, of course, you should be able to make money and keep your money, but if we are to be a compassionate country, which we ought to be, and I'll explain that in a second, if we ought to be a compassionate country, then it's the fair thing to do to ask that to compel you by law to frankly cough up a little bit of your money, because we should not be a cruel country. And the fact, and interestingly, if people were paid properly, there would be less need for welfare provisions. Let us think about that. Let us think about that very deeply. If people were paid properly, if most people were paid properly, there just wouldn't be as much need for welfare provisions. Moving on then to why we ought to be a compassionate country. And this sort of is my third political pillar, if you will. My first one being that we must be democratic. The second one being that certain freedoms should not be had, but most freedoms should be had. Those freedoms which lead to exploitation or infringing on the basic well-being on others, those freedoms should not be had. Those are my first two major political pillars of thought. My third one being this: we ought to be compassionate. Now, why should we be compassionate? Why is compassion such an important thing? Why is it that we should not be just self-interested and only self-interested? Ironically, perhaps, I would argue to you that in fact, it's actually in one's self-interest to be compassionate. We must ask ourselves, what kind of society and culture do we want to live in? Or put another way, what are our thoughts on living in a society where the people do well and where the people are well off and the people are as okay as they can be? Let's ask a question. In a society where a sizable number of people are unwell, they are very unhealthy, mentally, physically, chronic anxiety, anxiety so chronic that in fact their attempts to do well for themselves are impeded by the fact that they can't think clearly. We ought to have compassion for these people, because the fact is, otherwise, we're going to live in a society of angry people who are going to, frankly, bring us down as a culture and as a society. And that is simply something that I cannot be for. Secondly, I also believe it's literal cruelty to deny people basic charity or basic help if they are in fact so unable to take basic care of themselves. It seems to me that to just look the other way and say that it's in the name of freedom is literally to be cruel. It is literally to have no concern whatsoever for another person's suffering. I would characterize that, frankly, as inhumane. Again, I think it causes problems for society, which, frankly, is obvious if you look around today. So that's this conversation that I want to have on compassion. That, again, to review the first few points that I've made, first of all, there is such a thing as social well-being. Your society is going to be better off if the individuals within your society are better off. And to expand upon that a little bit, think about people as productive individuals. Do you want to live in a society that is very productive, where people feel well generally? Or do you want to live in a society where a lot of people are bitter and angry and depressed and needy and anxious and perhaps moved to be violent as a result, and be miserable and try to thrust their misery onto us? And how does that impact our economy, actually? It impedes our economy, because the fact is, if people were psychologically well, if people were especially psychologically well, they could think clearly and could be very productive and very, very clear of what they want to do, how they can best produce something or offer a service that, frankly, enriches them and enriches the society. And therefore, when we think about it from, frankly, a national security perspective, or just being a viable country, that, again, is to our literal advantage. So it's actually a what I would call a compassionate, egoistic approach that I am suggesting here with respect to compassion. And for this reason, I believe it's in everyone's interest as individuals to, yes, pay some taxes, to do things like take care of people who need our help. So that's a fundamental principle of mine, compassion. Again, for our social well-being. And secondly, just in terms of ethics, it is cruel to not care in general when others are suffering. That's literally just callousness. It's just callousness. And there is no reason to be callous. There's no reason whatsoever. And it's, in my opinion, just, it's unhealthy, I think, to be callous. It's antisocial, I think, to be callous. And it's an irrational estimation of that person's value. In other words, it's degrading. Right? That's the psychological thing that occurs when people are callous towards the suffering of others. They are literally viewing the suffering person with a view that they are less important, less deserving of a good life than you. So that's my evaluation, in part, on the importance and the moral imperative of compassion, which therefore gives reason to act politically and say, yes, you've got to pay taxes to help people out. So I think I have outlined the very basics of my political thinking. There are more nuanced conversations that can happen at the policy by policy level, but contrary to what Duke Manning has said about me, in fact, when I'm going to really talk about a policy very deeply, in fact, that's what I'm going to do. I am going to do the research and make a good presentation about it. That's actually my style. I encourage you to, in fact, do a more accurate reading of my more recent record instead of making claims about me from 5 years ago, things that I just don't relate to or think now and didn't even think really for that long, and that by no means whatsoever actually reflect who I am, how I think, why I think what I think, etc. And I want to see if I covered all the basics that were important to me with respect to that. Yes, I mean, I would just say that I don't believe that, again, contrary to what Duke Manning has said, I don't believe that my presentation here in these two videos makes me look bad. Frankly, I think it makes me look very transparent. A transparency that, which is important. I believe it's important to be transparent. And if that's what was needed or wanted from me, is transparency and accountability and a statement of basic beliefs that guide my political commentaries and activism, then here it is. But by no means does being transparent and elaborate harm my appearance. And in fact, the only people who seem to think I look so bad are dogmatic Trump supporters and condescending libertarians, as I understand it. I would say only that it's my hope that Duke Manning had no intention of coming across as condescending. My analysis and my interpretation was that it's condescending to speak down to somebody without really presenting evidence as to why you would make such harsh and unfounded statements. There is another pillar of my thinking, and you could call it the importance of politeness or diplomacy as well. And that is to say, along with being compassionate towards others, I think a huge element of compassion is politeness. And what do I mean by politeness or diplomacy? I would start by saying, by citing a principle, not exclusively Christian, but I like the way they say Jesus put it. Forgive them of their sins, they know not what they do. In my assessment, it seems illogical to say that someone does wrong with full conviction that they're doing wrong at the same time. It seems to me quite obvious that, for this I say that because, to me, as I understand it, the way humans think is that we can sort of believe something. We can have degrees of confidence or degrees of lacking confidence in an idea. I think that's just a very self-evident for anyone who introspects. For example, let's take the policy discussion of, I don't know, I don't have one off the top of my head, but let's talk about drug addiction. I think that what moves someone to not quite quit their drug habit, in part, is that they are not 100% convinced that they should stop or quit using that drug. They may have an intense degree of thought and belief that they perhaps ought to quit, They're perhaps quite cognizant of the damage that their addiction is having on them and the ones they love, but they might say, but I just don't ultimately, at the end of the day, see why I absolutely must quit. Though I see reason to believe that I should be maybe suspicious of it, but I'm not there yet. It seems to me that conviction is one thing, and a degree of confidence in something is quite another. So what does this abstract point that I'm making mean? What it means is, in my opinion, when you're going to discuss something that you think somebody has, when you're going to discuss with someone something you believe they've done incorrectly, that you shouldn't treat them, in my opinion, as if they are, first of all, you should not insult them. That's just not constructive, and I'll talk about that. But secondly, I think you have to run on the assumption that if they fully understood their error, if they fully understood why they were erroneous, there would be no problem. So clearly, they don't fully understand. So that's A, right? B, what's an effective means, therefore, of helping someone understand a mistake that they are making? What's a useful way to do this? Now, I'm a tutor, so I am fortunate to have a lot of experience in my training and in my day-to-day work to have experience in trial and error in terms of how you help someone understand something. And you certainly, therefore, you certainly don't chastise them. You certainly don't approach them with arrogance or spitefulness or condescension. That's just not going to really win them your confidence. You win someone's confidence when, first of all, you don't degrade them. Because when you approach someone with a tone that is degrading, then that person is going to perceive you as just an angry, degrading individual. And that person is not going to see that you have credibility or that you're even approaching the situation intellectually. They're going to see that you're approaching it subjectively and angrily and with in the ivory tower with a irrationally high estimation of yourself. So we need to approach this not just if we're going to be teachers, but we need to approach it if, in general, we're going to talk to each other. If we're going to talk to each other, we want to be constructive, not destructive. And this is important in politics. And this is one thing that is so deeply wrong about President Trump and his cult followers. That they believe that it's good to insult their critics. You may have been reading the news as there's all kinds of talk now about Omarosa Manigault Newman that President Trump called a dog. There is no reason in the world to call your critic a dog. She is not a dog, she's a human being. And what is going to be the effect of calling Omarosa a dog because she was critical of you? Well, first of all, you will come across as subjective and angry and a destructive force in the public discussion, right? That's first of all. Secondly, you just come across as angry and anti-intellectual. The conversation to have if you don't like what Omarosa said, Mr. President, is to say, Omarosa made these claims about me. Let me show you the concrete evidence why she's wrong. It's that simple. It's that simple. By the way, it is worth noting that Trump's press secretary, Sarah Huckabee Sanders, said she could not guarantee that Trump never used the N-word. Obviously, there is an air of uncertainty in her mind. Worth pointing out. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the psychology of insults, and I think it further demonstrates why it's so problematic. I'm looking at an article I read from Psychology Today called The Psychology of Insults, written by Dr. Nigel Barber, who wanted to write a little something on this, and it just struck me as interesting. That he put it this way: an insult can thus be interpreted as an attempt to reduce the social status of the recipient and raise the relative status of the insulter. He says basically this is status insecurity is what tends to motivate the insulter. It seems to him just sort of something we can implicitly deduce. And he talks about how one approach that people take in their insulting is to question someone's intelligence or general mental incompetence, to make someone look stupid or crazy. Frankly, Mr. Manning, I felt kind of insulted that you went out of you tried to paint me, I feel frankly, as stupid or incompetent by citing something I said 5 years ago, which doesn't reflect anything I believe now, and didn't for very long then also. So I did feel insulted, I admit, but I know it would be fair to say that it wasn't necessarily your intention. But how we treat people and how we approach people matters. And the one approach is, again, condescension and misrepresenting people, and the other approach is objectivity and citing evidence. We know in the realm of logic, right, the ad hominem attack, we know that when people therefore attack characters of someone and suggest that therefore that person is not credible in a particular claim, that's right, that's a fallacy. But the ad hominem attack is rampant in the Trump cult. And it's something that just shouldn't be. There's a really good quote I got from T.S. Bogorod, who is a lawyer who decided to write a book on the importance of civility. He said on page 28 of his book, the healthier the members of a community are, the healthier the community is. He wrote, communities require the cooperation of its members, and generally the better we interact with others, the more likely others will cooperate with us. In other words, and further, if there is less cooperation in a community, we weaken our communities. I mean, and it goes back to the conversation I was having about compassion. It's the same thing. If we live in a society where we are degrading and callous, we will have a degraded society. And one should not want to live in a degraded society because it limits the incredible vitality which the society can have. I don't know if anyone in my audience at this point has any questions or thought there was something I said that didn't make sense or felt that it wasn't well articulated or thought that I was guilty of a contradiction. But I encourage you, if there's something I said that, again, you find contradictory or unclear, do tell me. This is certainly an opportunity to do so. Since there are no comments at this particular moment, I want to therefore just essentially review and summarize today's two video blogs. So to begin with, right, I received a 6-paragraph criticism from philosophy student Duke Manning, who's a member of the Libertarian Party, accusing me essentially of intellectual unfitness, really. Of course, it's always fair to use his words. I always like to cite people directly over paraphrasing as much as possible anyway. Yes, he says I have a thought without really doing enough research. And I thought that that was not true. So I wanted to make sure it was clear. I wanted to substantiate the fact that it's not true. And that was why I wanted to have this discussion and show you that, in fact, I have thought thoroughly about my philosophy, even my philosophy more broadly than just in politics. I have quite a defined system of my own refinements of Ayn Rand's idea of objectivism. I agree with objectivism, but not Ayn Rand's interpretation or application of it. So yeah, the idea that I'm not someone who has a refined way of thinking could only be made by someone who just doesn't know my life story and the work I've done to establish and define for myself a systematic philosophy, not just of politics, but of epistemology and aesthetics, ethics, politics, psychology, etc. Of course, while I have broad principles, I find myself most interested in political stuff. So that's where I put the greatest degree of thought. And it's just something that I want on record. I want on record that I think thoroughly about my political ideology. And I could, of course, write a treatise or a book outlining this in much more thorough wording. However, that would take so long that I just wouldn't get other things done. So I'm doing it, I'm doing a sort of abbreviated version now. I just really want it on record. That, in fact, I have spent the greater part of the last 5 years wrestling with political questions and having them answered as much as I could by consulting a variety of sources. I didn't cite everything today because, again, if I brought up every issue to you that I've ever thought about and had to give you an annotated bibliography of everything that I've consulted when contemplating something, I just wouldn't have the time. Again, that would be a book, and I'm not writing a book right now. And the suggestion, anyway, that a person needs to have a book-style articulated ideology to be considered legitimate in having basic political opinions, I think is arrogant and in denial of the human capacity to make pretty obvious deductions if they put the effort in logically analyzing certain things. And okay, again, yeah, same thing. He said, I'm the kind of person who gets an idea and runs with it without really investigating it deeply. just not true. If you want a really good example, one of my proudest examples that would refute this, by the way, is my blog explaining the case for impeaching Trump on the grounds of treason. That was a heavily sourced commentary, and it was not just citing political pundits, though I did cite a few, but also I weighed the opinions and synthesized the opinions of legal experts and other experts and other official documents and legal language, etc. So if you really think I'm a person who has an idea and doesn't think about the idea that I offer, read my case for impeaching Trump on the grounds of treason. And you can look at the bibliography and the hyperlinks, and it will demonstrate quite thoroughly that, in fact, when I present an idea, I present it quite thoroughly. It was also suggested that I need to bolster my constitution of constitutional law, case law, and economics. I just don't know what, why, or how. And since it was Duke Manning who made that claim, it would seem to me that he needs to explain why he thinks that. And it seems to me hypocritical to suggest that I don't substantiate my ideas by not substantiating that fact. And the final thing, I guess, here was that Duke Manning wanted to suggest that as I present myself currently, I am harming my appearance. Look, I'm not ashamed of the logical deductions I've made. I don't feel that my appearance has been harmed. In fact, the only people who insult me and my appearance are, again, dogmatic members of the Trump cult who wouldn't question anything he did, ever, and the occasional angry libertarian who just doesn't like my ideas. And, but yeah, I've got to say, if you're concerned about my appearance, I don't share your concern. I am proud of my ideology. I am proud of my commitment to the abolition of the Electoral College. I am proud of my commitment to demanding that Trump be impeached. I am proud of my demand that we have a public option for healthcare for those who can't afford health insurance. I am proud of my belief and my findings that there ought to be more gun control. I'm sorry that that doesn't comport, perhaps, with your ideology, if you're a critic of mine, but to suggest that my views are not based on scrupulous thought would not be true. That you find them wrong is fine, and I'm willing to have that conversation, but I think if it's an attack on my intellectual integrity you're after, that's something I don't agree with. And that was the initial purpose for this, and it's something that I just don't know if I can stress enough, that attacking someone's intellectual credibility I view as an inherently insulting thing. If you're going to attack someone's intellectual credibility, I think that what you need to do is thoroughly examine that person's intellectual commentaries or intellectual ideas. For example, when I attack the character of Trump, I mean, day by day, I cite hourly instances of his constant insults at critics and his attacks of his critics and his policy of stripping babies from their parents at the border because the parents were so awful that they sought political asylum and were of the understanding that people receive due process when they seek the possibility of political asylum. If there could be one takeaway that can be had from these two video blogs, it is this. Whatever you may think of my deductions, whatever you may think of my ideology, it could be your interpretation that I'm quite contradictory, and it could be your interpretation that I'm wrong, but I do not lack intellectual integrity. I am not intellectually lazy. And I do not arrive at my political perspective hastily or with, it's not easy for me to quickly say I'm for something. I put a lot of thought into why I think what I think. And so I wanted to make that clear. That's why I made this response, not only to defend my intellectual credibility and integrity, and to defend myself against what I interpreted as perhaps unwittingly an insult. Also, I suppose it's advantageous at this point to make it as clear as possible that I disavow my old self. I disavow the Sean who existed for the first 25 years of his life. I was a person that I am not fond of. I disavow my libertarian period. I disavow I condemn myself for having been a libertarian. I condemn myself for having been a member of the Libertarian Party. I condemn myself for having been a Republican. I condemn myself for not having been a Democrat. I am a Democrat. I believe that there is a strong case that I have presented for why I am a Democrat. And the pillars of my particular unique individual brand of social democracy is this, as I said, just recapping here to sort of make my conclusion. First of all, my politics is informed by epistemology. I believe in logic. I believe in the law of identity and the law of non-contradiction. A is A therefore cannot be B. That's my fundamental principle. I believe ethically that people ought to thrive, and to not want to thrive is just the experience of degradation based on contradictions one holds. And while I say that someone, of course, has it's within their free will, if they're going to degrade themselves, that's fine, but certainly they have no authority to force others to degrade themselves. And so I said that my sort of fundamental or primary political principle derives in the question of who ought to have authority, why they ought to have authority, and what kind of authority they ought to have. And I said it came down to democracy being the best. And I said so because there's no evidence that there's no statement floating in the sky from a God that says that any individual should have more political power than anybody else inherently. And so it makes sense that we should democratically decide our rules. It's actually kind of capitalistic in a way, because capitalistically, we also vote on which products should be bought. I apply basic capitalism to democracy, but I say, or libertarianism in that sense. But democracy is not perfect, and we must come up with rules that make democracy work and not harm people or cause undue inequality in the political voting experience. And I apply that to libertarianism and say that, yes, freedom is good, but there are imperfections with unfettered freedom that lead to exploitation, which the history, certainly of the United States, has proven time and time again. Whether you want to look at slavery or union busting or exploitation, if you want to look at the case of Apple and the fact that Apple pays their Chinese workers cookie crumbs, essentially. And because they're allowed to, they take advantage of unfettered freedom and exploit. And so I said that there needs to be some curbing of freedom so that people can't do that and harm others in that way. And I said, third, that compassion is important. And compassion plays a role in justifying things like taxation and funding welfare policies. So there you have it. You have why I decided I needed to speak with you today, and my position on my intellectual style and its credibility. You may not agree with what I say, but I think that I am at least thought out quite thoroughly in my thinking. And I have identified my history, my personal history, politically speaking, albeit in abbreviated form, and I have described the fundamentals of my basic philosophy, and I have described the fundamental concepts of my political philosophy. And I have demonstrated that I put a lot of scrupulous logical analysis into these things. It's true that they're informed by sometimes things other people have made clear to me, and I did not cite those individuals today because I said it would amount to a long and a very long annotated bibliography, which I'm just not tasking myself right now with writing a book. And I said again, my basic pillars of my political philosophy: democracy, not permitting unfettered freedom, and being compassionate. That is what I am on record as saying I believe in, and these are the rationales behind why I think these things. If you want to talk about me and my political opinions, I always urge you to refer to this as a sort of manifesto, a sort of basic guideline for why I think what I think and how I think what I think. I want to thank you so much. Oh, and finally, the fourth thing, not just being compassionate, but also being polite and diplomatic. It's constructive. Thank you so very much for taking the time to take an interest in my political opinions and my political manifesto of sorts. I look forward to having more discussions with you and look forward to your feedback and things you think that I said that are contradictory and problematic. I am happy to discuss it with you. Please have a fantastic day. Thank you. And I would encourage you also for supplementary information to give you a better idea of applications of my political philosophy at present. Please do take a look at my blog where things that I feel reflect something that I feel proud of saying exists. My blog is called Public Comment. The web address is publiccomment.blog. I encourage you, for those who are interested in learning more about what I've said, or if you think it's important for others to give a listen to what I've said today, please share this video with them. And if you like my blog, please share my blog, publiccomment.blog. Again, thank you so much. Have a fantastic day. I'll just close by saying one thing, a sort of personal, to Duke Manning. I want you to know that if I came across in any way as condescending or rude or emotional, it was a mistake. I didn't mean to do it. If it certainly wasn't your intention to impeach, if you will, my intellectual integrity, I appreciate that. Certainly, I don't mean to attack your intellectual integrity, but if you're going to say, what do I put more pride in than just about anything other than taking care of myself and being loving to my wife and my friends and family and just being a decent person? Well, beyond those two, and being logical, the only other thing that I really put so much pride into and really want to put as much work into as possible is my intellectual thinking on a particular thing that I espouse a viewpoint of. I take a lot of pride in that, and I work every day to sharpen it, and I work every day to become more informed and always to be intellectually responsible. So I just want you to know that that is the case. And I don't quite take offense to what you said, but I am going to offer you the critique that your tone was condescending, probably, hopefully, unwittingly, and that in my interpretation, you didn't back up your argument by using something from 5 years ago that I barely held on to, and that certainly doesn't reflect what I think now. You just don't have an argument standing at present, as I interpret it. So thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Hey, thank you to Duke Manning for taking the time to bring up a conversation that ended in me doing this, because it gave me the opportunity to establish some essentials of my political thinking. So thank you, Mr. Duke Manning. Thank you, everyone watching today. And I will talk to you again very soon. Again, have a wonderful day.